Well, when my wife and I first landed in Tacoma, Washington to plant what is now Soma Communities, we started with a vision that comes out of Ephesians. And if you look at Ephesians 1, you see that God has chosen us, predestined us, adopted us, made us who we are so that we would be people who exist for the praise of His glorious grace. And the intent of God is that we would be a people who bring Him glory in all things. And if you keep reading to the end of Ephesians 1, Paul says, I want you to understand what you have. I want you to understand this power that you have, this inheritance that you have, this position that you have. And as he talks about all that we have in Christ, he says, He seated him in the heavenly realms. This is verse 20. He's at the right hand in the heavenly places, far above all rule and authority and power and dominion, above every name that's named, not only in this age, but also in the one to come. And He put all things under His feet and gave Him His head over all things to the church, which is His body, the fullness of Him who fills all in all. And we came with a fundamental conviction that there is no other senior pastor than Jesus Christ. He's the head of His church. He is the one to whom all things exist and through whom all things will be accomplished. And we began to call people to a vision where it wasn't just us building a church, but Jesus building a church in and through us. And I remember sitting down with people and drawing out on a napkin for them just to help them understand and say, most people think of the church as a building that people go to. They give their money to support the programs that take place within it, their time, their gifts and resources. And the pastors that kind of run those events and gatherings tend to be what most people have in their mind when they think church. They think of the building, the pastors, the programs. And in a lot of ways, the structures that we build to run and sustain and organize churches, in a lot of ways, serve almost like containers to hold people in. It's almost as if we're extracting people from the world instead of equipping them and sending them into the world. And so what I want us to do is I want us to say that we are going to gather, we are going to equip, we are going to train for the purpose of sending you out to fill all in all. This is Jesus' vision for His church, I believe. That when he says, Paul says He's the head of the body in which He fills all in all, I think we need to read that two ways. One, He fills us with Himself. One thing I want to constantly remind our church with is this idea that you are not going out to be Jesus to people. You are going out with Jesus in you to people. You're bringing Him everywhere you go. And He's filling you, but He wants to fill everything with His presence. And so we would draw this picture and I'd say, imagine this is our city, Tacoma. And the call that we have on us is to be God's people sent for God's purposes to declare His power in the gospel so that the city that we live in will get filled with the presence of Christ in everything. So that there's no possible way that anybody would ever be able to be removed from the possibility of hearing and seeing the gospel of Jesus Christ through His people. That's the intent for His church. And as I would walk through it, I'd say, no, let's look how this takes place. In chapter 2, it says we've been saved by grace. But it says we've also been saved for something, for good works which He prepared in advance for us to do. You've been saved by God's work, for God's work. And then we would move further and we'd say, when we look at the people who God gave to the church in Ephesians 4 as gifts to the church, He didn't give those people to the church to be the ministers of the church. He gave those people to the church, apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers, to equip the people of the church to be the ministers of the church. That's the intent. So when I would call people to what we were going to do, and as we began to equip and train, I reminded them over and over and over again, you are the ministers of this church. In fact, you're full-time paid staff of this church that we're going to see started. And they're all looking around for the paycheck. Where's it coming from? And I said, fundamentally, every one of us, and this is true for everyone in the room, whether you get your paycheck with a little stamp on the side of it that says your church's name, or whether it says Microsoft in our case, or Starbucks, or Boeing, or wherever it may be, God is routing His money, His resource to you through some other company so that you can be paid for full-time ministry wherever He sends you. It means every single person in the church is a full-time paid minister of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And the job of those of us who are pastors or teachers or apostles or evangelists or prophets is to equip the saints for works of ministry, not to do the ministry for the saints. If you don't structure your church in such a way that the saints are doing the ministry and you're equipping the saints for ministry, what you'll convince your people of is that they pay you to do ministry for them and they receive it all from you. And they'll buy into the idea that this is not about the church making disciples, but this is about a few who are paid to make disciples and the rest applaud them because they do the job nobody else wants to do. I used to call this the mercenary mentality of the church. We pay someone else to go do what we don't want to do. And we've got to call the church to be the church. And so what we did when my wife and I started with a few of us, we just pulled some people together into our house, started to meet, care for them, love them. I remember an old guy named Ray came in as we were teaching him the scriptures, and he said, "Pastor, it's your job to feed me." And I said, "Actually, no, it's going to be your job to feed others." And he had been in the church 20, 30 years, and his highest view of what he could do in the church was be an usher. He'd usher people, and he thought that was ministry. That's called event volunteering. Let's just make sure we're clear on that. Okay? Running an event on Sunday and serving in it is not the greatest plan that God had for every person in our church. He didn't die so we could hand out baskets and call it ministry when we were taking a collection. I'm not saying those are bad things to do. I'm just saying, please have a higher vision for your people than that. Jesus died for something much more than that. And I remember sitting down with Ray and I said, "Ray, I want to ask you, it seems that Jesus said the food that I have, that you know nothing of, is to do the will of my Father who sent me. So, Ray, this week, I'm going to ask you to read your Bible, ask the Spirit to speak into your life, and tell you whatever He wants you to do, journal everything He tells you, do exactly what He says, and come back and tell me how well fed you were this last week." He came back the next Sunday and he said, "Man, I got a whole different view on church." So that was the best feeding I've had in my life. And Ray went from being a guy who carried a basket and opened doors and welcomed people at the door to being a guy who started to share the gospel with people. We found out he had a latent evangelist gift that kind of got on fire all of a sudden. And he began to serve people that were coming out of homelessness, and he began to counsel them and care for them. And it's almost like this old 60-some-year-old guy just woke up and said, "I've got a role here in the church. And it's not in a building. It's in this city and in my neighborhood and where God sends me to be His carrier of Him and His gospel." And he began to believe. So we did stuff like that, and we trained people within our home to begin to care for one another, to share the gospel to one another. Ephesians 4 says, when we train each other, we train them how to speak the truth in love. And when we do that, then we grow each other up, and therefore the church becomes mature, attaining to the full measure of Christ. And the picture of maturity is not a few teaching, but everybody being able to speak the truth to one another in such a way that everybody's growing up in Christ. And so this question of structure you need to ask is, have we structured in such a way that everybody becomes a carrier of Jesus, a declarer of the gospel, ones who know how to speak the truth in love, and see all of life as the ministry that they're called to? Not just something that happens in one little place or a couple hours. And so we would train these people, and after about 9 months of this first group, we had a few leaders. We said, "Hey, we want you to now go out into your neighborhood, into your house, and begin to call people around the table, dinners, parties, serving in the community, believers, unbelievers, and begin to talk about Jesus, begin to live out the life that Jesus called you to do amongst the people that He sent you to, and begin to call them to surrender their life to Christ and begin to minister to the people that God's given you, both believer and unbeliever." And so we saw that the most effective carrier for discipleship is not an event. I want to tell you that the downside of what we're doing right now is none of you are going to get equipped from this time right now. You're going to get informed. You might even get challenged. You might get exhorted. You might get kind of jarred a bit. But if you don't go do anything about what we talk about in the next 2 days, you're not getting equipped. Equipping isn't a new knowledge. Equipping is the ability to obey everything Jesus commands us. And so we realize that the best place for equipping is in life. A lot of our people would even start to think a missional community is an event we do on Tuesday night together for 2 hours. And we have to keep reminding them, no, this missional community idea is a family of people, believers, living life together in the whip and warp of all of life, in such a way that we're rubbing up against each other, speaking the truth to one another, eating together, watching how we parent our kids together, seeing how we train up our kids to share the gospel themselves, training people how to have a good marriage. I mean, it's the whole deal. And so we basically said, if we don't live life together, we won't disciple each other. When Paul says to Timothy, entrust to reliable men, faithful men, these things I've entrusted you, and do it in such a way that it continues on, the key word there is faithful. How do you know if somebody's faithful to what you've taught them? You have to see them live it out. I'm convinced that most of our churches give nods to us every week, and we think they're living a life that's in line with the truth of the gospel, and they're not. And you don't even know it if you're a pastor, unless you're in their life or someone else is in their life. So we realized the only way to disciple is life on life in the midst of everyday life. We determined from the very beginning, let's not put on a bunch of events or programs that extract people from life, but rather let's equip people to live normal, ordinary life with significant gospel intentionality. It's a very different way to do church as far as I'm concerned, because it says, now your life counts. Instead of us pulling you out of your life, we're just equipping you for life with one another. We also realize that if you don't also call people to a mission together, to have a people group that they're devoting their lives to and radically reorienting their lives around so that they can disciple people into Christ, then likely what they do is they learn how to live life with a bunch of Christians, which becomes very ingrown and oftentimes very codependent. We just kind of do navel-gazing every week, oh yeah, I know. Wouldn't it be great if someone else knew? And we have no mission, and so we had to realize we've got to help our people clarify who has God sent you to? Who's the people He's calling you to reach? And as you clarify that together, you as a community of believers reorient your whole life around what that would look like. An exercise often that we would do is we'd say, can you imagine, like Dr. Watson, if you were sent to another part of the country, another part of the world, let's say, and you were going to be missionaries there, what would you do? And we'd have them list out all the things they do. We'd sell what we have, slim down, get our stuff so it could fit into crates. We would, realign our whole world views on how do we engage a different culture, learn languages. And they would list all this stuff. And I'd go, man, you guys really have a good idea what it means to be missionaries. Now do that in your neighborhood, because you're the missionaries here. And so we'd ask them to realign their whole life around the mission of making disciples of a particular people group. And we spent about 9 months training this original core how to do that. And when we launched Soma, we didn't launch a service. I just don't see that in the Scriptures. I don't see this idea like we're going to have a big launch and it's a service. Show me that. The only launch I see of the church is Jesus commissioning His disciples and the Spirit falling on them and lots of people getting saved. That's the closest thing we've got to a church service launch. It's not really that. So we said, let's launch people. Let's commission people. And we prayed over these first few and commissioned them to start their own groups. And we started out with about 4. And then they began to, in each group, make sure that as a missional community leader, they had an apprentice. And they were there. We sowed into the beginning of each group this idea that you're going to multiply eventually. And the job is not just to mainly stay together, but to equip the believers for works of ministry so eventually we can commission another group out to go start reaching another people group in our city. And this just continued. Went from 4 to 8 to 16 to 32, and now we have somewhere in the 40s. And in each one of these groups, as they would multiply, we'd see a church started. And what was said earlier is so true. You don't go plant a church emerges out of the planting of the gospel and a people being devoted to one another in the gospel and sent out to make disciples in the gospel. And then this is how we'd actually raise up all of our elders. We don't have an elder track that looks like sitting in a classroom getting trained. Our elder track is actually doing ministry. You learn how to be an elder of a church by actually being an elder of a small flock. If you can't lead a few people in discipleship who can make disciples, why would we ever entrust you to a whole big church of that? So that's how we train up all our elders. What we've been able to experience is God being very gracious to us. I've seen artists who thought art was all about leading up here, which is great, move into the pubs and begin to play there and teach other artists to write songs that reflect the gospel. And just this last week, one of our artists who's taken about 3 years to finally get it, said he just led all of his artists to proclaim Jesus in very creative ways through song at one of our local cafes. And I sat back there and just thought to myself, This was the dream we always hoped for, that everybody could be in the game. You'd be surprised at what the church can do if you believe that Jesus is in them. Start believing that he can do great things through them.